Like a lot of people, you've put a lot on hold. Eating in restaurants, praying in your house of worship, attending sporting events, all to protect your health. So as we all start to get back, the same people who have been protecting your health all along are the people doing the most to keep your health safe. Always. We're open for emergency care and for appointments safely for you. CHI St. Luke's Health Memorial.
Well, we're excited today to have Dr. Keven Ellis with us.
Happy to
Keven
be here.
is known to a lot of our locals as a great chiropractor that's here. But we are excited to be able to visit with you today because of your position on the State Board of Education. So welcome to the Chamber Podcast and
Thank you.
Connect.
Thanks, Tara.
And tell us a little bit about your history. You're married to Shelley and you have 3 great kids.
Yeah, so I'm sure we'll talk. I was on the local school board, but the reason I ran for that is I had 3 children who this community served so well and took care of, and I wanted to give back to that. So we raised, Shelley and I got married. We lived in Houston and realized real quickly we didn't want to raise them in Houston. So we moved up here when the twins were 2 and John was 6 months old, and Lufkin was a great place to raise a family, and I would recommend that for anyone.
Well, so you mentioned being on the school board. How long were you on the school board?
Yeah, so let me back up a little bit and kind of how I got there. And I never had the end in mind in this whole process. And so one evening we're at the house and Lufkin was doing a bond project, and they started the Quality Schools Task Force. It was a group that they were getting together to work on a bond. And so they were inviting community members, and Shelley got invited to that with a postcard. And she looked at it and she tossed it to me and she said, "I don't want to go to this. You go to it." I went, "All right, I'll go to it." And I was just amazed as they went through what happens in our school systems, from the finance to the curriculum to the nutritional aspect of it and the food service and the facilities. And it really got me interested in what happened. So anyways, the bond went through. And after that, I got invited to serve on the triethnic committee that Lufkin has had for many years. And then at one point in time, I think it was in 2012, Gip Friesen and Cooper Castleberry both decided not to run for school board. I'd done those other things. So decided to run for the Lufkin School Board. And again, it was something that I really wanted to be able to give back to the community for everything the community had done for our kids. It's Lufkin ISD, and I know all the other surrounding school districts also, it's just such a tight-knit community where everyone looks out for everyone else, and I really enjoyed that.
So a year ago today, which is kind of a cool coincidence, Governor Abbott actually appointed you to the State Board of Education.
Right.
So tell us about that day that it all came to fruition.
Yeah, that was interesting in the fact of the board chair is appointed from among the 15 members. So he can't pick someone who's not on the board to be the chair, but among the 15 members. So that's how that went about. And as we went through the process, you can serve 4 years as board chair. Okay. And so our previous chair had served for the 4 years and her time was up. But a year ago plus, a few months back, we had the tragic shootings. We had it in El Paso and then in the Panhandle. And so that rightly so took a lot of the governor's and his office's attention away from doing some of their appointments. So it really drug out about 3 or 4 months until it got to this point in time. But I was extremely honored for him to choose me to chair the State Board of Education. From what I know and what others have told me, I'm the first one from East Texas to chair the State Board.
That's awesome.
That's great.
Can you tell us a little bit about what the State Board of Education does? Kind of a broad overview of that.
Yeah, so there's really probably well, let me start with what it's not.
Okay.
It's I always tell people you could probably stump people at a dinner party by asking them what the State Board of Education, but a few things it's not a high-paying job. It's not even a low-paying job. In fact, it's a no-paying job. Right. So it's all volunteer, and that's I think, good and proper. The other thing is it's not a full-time job where I've moved to Austin. I've had a lot of people say, well, who's taken over your practice now that you're in Austin? I'm like, no, this is just my volunteer work.
Right.
And my wife always appreciates it if I spend more time on my paying job than I do my volunteer job.
Sure.
And then also to kind of make that a little bit current, it's not something that's really dealt when we talk about the COVID and the pandemic. The State Board really has not had any influence in what's happened with how the education system has had to shift in the pandemic. We do the curriculum standards and the textbooks, what I'll talk about, but all the should kids be back in school, should kids not be back in school at this point is all fallen on the Commissioner of Education. So that's been an interesting process because I think people look, well, you're on the State Board of Education. What's happening with our kids?
I would have assumed that you would
kids
have
in
helped with
school,
this
yeah.
decision.
Same here.
And it's not frustrating in a sense, but just really feel like we're having to sit on our hands because it's just not something that falls under our purview in such a critical time. But to answer your question, what do we do? There's three main pillars. We have about 35 duties assigned to us by the legislature, but there's three main duties. The first is the curriculum standards, and that is what every child is supposed to learn across the state. It's designed so the same kid in Lufkin is going to learn the same thing in third grade math as the same as a third grader in El Paso or in Houston or in Dallas. So every grade, every subject has their curriculum standards. And think of it as like an outline or kind of the bare bones or what I call the skeleton of what kids need to learn. Each local district then decides what curriculum, not the curriculum standards we do, but the curriculum. And that's like putting the flesh on the skeleton. That's how, and we do the what. And then the districts do the how and the when it's going to be taught. So that's the balance between the curriculum standards. So there's about 9 different subjects. There's the 4 core subjects, which is science, math, English, and social studies. There's some enrichment subjects such as health and languages other than English or foreign languages and such as that. Tech apps and so forth. And then there's CTE courses. So there's about 9 different types of courses, and we review them about once a year. So about every 10 years, we'll review each one of these subjects. And so that's, I think, probably the most important thing that we do is review those. Some of them that we've done recently, we've done social studies in 2018. And I don't know if you've heard about this, but you'll hear a lot of teachers say that our curriculum standards are a mile wide and an inch deep. And what they're saying is there's so much that has to be taught that they just have to speed through everything. They can't go into the depth they want to go into because there's so much in there. So we were asked to streamline the social studies, for example. And what we did is we narrowed it down. We talked about the description I gave it is like, if you have our standards, I'm going to give you a pair of scissors, but not a writing utensil. You can't add anything, but we can cut things away. So that's what we did with social studies. And all of them were probably a little bit what I call bloated, but social studies was the chief offender of that. For example, I did a quick count. We had about K through 12, we had about 400 different individuals that we expect our kids to learn about, just all the way through K through 12. And we cut about 20% of those out. So we narrowed it down in there. Science is the other one that we streamlined in 2018. We're actually doing a full revision of that now. Of course, science always gets a little bit controversial when you get to high school biology and evolution and creation and so forth. So there's that there. And then what's really on our hot topic right now, and we can talk a little more detail about what this process is looking like, but we're doing health right now also. I mentioned that we do each subject about every 10 years. 10 years ago, the state board decided they didn't want to deal with it. So it's been 20 years since our health curriculum standards across the state has been looked at. And you can imagine there's been some significant changes in what's taught in health in the last 20 years. So an extremely heavy lift to go through all the new research that's out there and what needs to be taught and so forth. And then, of course, you have sex education when you have health. So that's definitely a hot topic that we're
It's definitely a hot topic right now in the news. Sure.
So the kind of second pillar of what we do that ties into that is the instruction material. So when I mention the curriculum standards, that affects a lot of things. It affects how our 350,000 teachers across the state teach our 5.4, almost 5.5 million students now. It affects the assessment system. You know, they're tested over what we put in the curriculum standards. And then it's what goes in the textbook. So we approve the instructional material. And there's always been a phrase you'll hear that says, as goes Texas, so goes the nation. And that Texas rules the roost on textbooks. And 10, 15 years ago, that was really, really accurate in the fact that if a district was going to produce a textbook, they would produce one for Texas, how Texas wanted it, probably how California and Florida and New York, but they weren't going to write a whole separate book for North Dakota or for Idaho because they didn't have the market. So they would sell them our book. And so Texas had a lot of influence on what textbooks looked like across the nation. That's changed a bit for a couple of reasons. Number one is digital printing. In the old days, you were physically laying that on a printing press, and if you change one paragraph, you have to relay out the whole book.
Hard to make
Now,
quick changes.
Yeah, so now it's right-click delete, and they can make changes for another state a lot easier than they could. And then the second reason is Common Core. Common Core has been adopted by 40-something, maybe 42, 43 states. So the buying power of those 40 plus states is at least equal to Texas's. So there is another kind of big monster out there with Common Core. Texas does not teach the Common Core standards, but that's another thing that's come into play with the textbooks. When we adopt textbooks, the publishers write a textbook and they come ask for adoption for us. And the other kind of nuance or important point to talk about is that when we approve a textbook, I think a lot of people feel that we've given it the good State Board of Education housekeeping stamp of approval. Like we said, that's a good book. But we can actually only reject a textbook for a couple of reasons. It used to be 3. We just had a 4th one added to us. We could reject a textbook if it had factual errors, if it didn't contain 50% of the TEKS, the standards that I was talking about it, or if it had poor binding. There's a funny story with that.
Poor binding.
Poor binding. This goes back to,
One of these things is not like the other.
Yeah. And there's a funny story there. I had a member, he just recently rolled off the board, and there was a math book that he really didn't like. And so it was time for adoption. And he was trying to figure out how he could get it rejected. So the TEA attorney was sitting over there, and he said, well, how can I reject this textbook? And they said, well, it says right here, if there's factual errors in it, you can reject it. And he said, well, is there any factual errors? And they said, no, we've determined there's no factual errors. I said, okay, how else? And he said, well, if it doesn't contain 50% of the standards. And he said, okay, well, does it contain 50% of the standards? And they said, yes, it contains 50. And he said, is there anything else? And they said, well, it says if it has poor binding, then you can reject it. And the book was sitting right there. He said, hand me that book. And he took the book and he ripped it in half and he tore the binding off. He said, this has poor binding. I reject it. And I asked him, I called him by name. I said, what would have happened if you tried to tear it and you couldn't get it? He said, I guess the book would have gone through. But so the other thing, so it's always been those 3.
So
and
they added a 4th, right?
Yeah, they added a 4th, which is suitability. Suitability for grade level. This is going to be important with health coming up. So now the legislator has granted us the authority that if what's in that textbook is not suitable for grade level, that's the exact phrase, we can reject it for that.
Your chest pain. It may mean nothing, but it may take everything. Know the symptoms of a heart attack. If you have any of them, get to the nearest emergency room. We're waiting for you. It's your health, so everything is up to you. Everything. This message brought to you by Woodland Heights Medical Center, home of a nationally accredited chest pain center. Log on to learn more.
Are you interested in buying or selling real estate? I'm Becky Coda, broker and co-owner with my husband Kevin here at Century 21 Coda Realty. We have 21 agents that are highly trained and committed to delivering an extraordinary buying or selling experience. Contact us today to see how we can help you.
So that's the process that we go through on the.
So when you're looking at a book and you're trying to decide if this should be approved, I mean, are you reading the whole book? Or are you
No, because, let's say we do social
I'm
studies.
like, you would be awesome at Jeopardy or any of that.
Yeah. We may get 18 different publishers submit books for K through 12. I mean, the books would literally stack to the ceiling. So that we work with the Texas Education Agency, and they hire review panels.
Okay.
So people can volunteer for that. They get a little stipend, and it's usually educators, but anyone can do that. And that's one of the things we ask for when I go to the community talks and stuff is, we want your input, and this is a way to do it, where they give you a section to go over, and you're looking for those things. Does it cover the TEKS? Does it have factual errors? So we have review teams that give us reports back that says those things. Of course, if there's a hot topic book, we'll take a close look at that one.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. So before you served on the State Board of Education, you were the vice chair of the Texas Commission on Public School Finance.
Yeah. Let me go. There's kind of one more pillar before we
Okay.
go that way.
Sure.
Let me talk about the third pillar that we work through in the State Board of Education is we manage the permanent school fund.
Okay.
And I mentioned kind of everything that we do is a duty that's granted to us by the legislature, except for this one. This is actually in the Texas Constitution that the State Board of Education manages the permanent school fund. So the permanent school fund, this is another interesting story, started in, if we remember our history, in the Compromise of 1850. Remember when Texas looked a little different and had parts of Colorado and Oklahoma and New Mexico? Well, the federal government bought that back to make Texas look like it does today, but they gave Texas $2 million. And the legislators back in the time put that into public education. That money almost got squandered away. It went down to, I think, $60,000. And they spent money on railroads and building roads and actually munitions for the Civil War. And they basically almost squandered it away. But they started building that back up as a way to fund public education. And the other interesting story is that all the money that the state has from oil and gas revenue on state lands all flows into this, and it goes offshore. So any drilling that goes offshore. And the federal government has said that anything up to 3 miles offshore, it's the state's money, and all that would flow in. Well, Texas sued the federal government, and Texas, only one other state, I think it was South Carolina, said, no, it should be 3 leagues, not 3 miles. 3 leagues is 10 miles, and we won in the 1960s and suing the federal government. So we get all oil and gas revenue up to 10 miles off the state of Texas's shore as opposed to 3 miles. And you can imagine there's a lot of drilling out there.
Sure.
So that has led this fund to surpassing $40 billion. And we manage that in collaboration with the School Land Board, which is chaired by Commissioner George P. Bush. We have about 75% of it. Their office has about 25% of that. It's the largest educational trust in the United States, just surpassed Harvard as the largest trust. So we manage that in every biennium, every 2 years before the legislature meets, we pull a certain percentage of it. We do a distribution to help fund public education. We're going through our discussions now. Like, for example, we're about to distribute about $3 billion of that into the budget for next time to help kind of fund public education, buy textbooks, and then just general funds for education. So that's the third pillar of what we do there.
Well, those are 3 important pillars.
Extremely
Yeah.
important
Yeah,
pillars.
absolutely.
How many times do y'all meet?
So we meet 5 times a year,
Okay.
but when we meet, it's 3, 4, or 5 days at a time. So it's not often throughout
Yeah.
the year, but when we're there, it's a lot of days in a row. Now I was just in Austin last week, just got back, and that was our first meeting since January.
Right.
Due to COVID. We did 2 Zoom meetings in between, but normally it's 5 times a year.
Okay. Well, I'll go back and talk about, as you as the vice chair of the Texas Commission on Public School Finance, tell us about that experience, and then from there, what made you want to run for the state board?
Yeah. So just for clarification, I was on the state board first.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm
So
sorry.
just in the timeline, I served on the Lufkin School Board from 2012 to 2016. So
Okay.
about 4.5 years I was there. So I ran for the State Board of Education in 2016. And if you remember, I had a quite interesting opponent
Yes.
that we all went through there. So that was in 2016. So I'm finishing up my 4th year on the state board just this past year as chair.
As chair, okay.
Yeah. So let's go to the School Finance Commission. In 2017, during that legislative session, they figured it was going to be a lot about school finance. And the lieutenant governor made a comment. He was trying to get vouchers put into the system. And he said, school finance will not happen unless we have vouchers. Well, the House Public Ed Committee chair said, vouchers are dead on arrival. That's how that session started. And it kind of went downhill from there.
Oh, wow.
So they got to the end of the session. Of course, nothing had been done. And the House said, you know what? We've studied this long enough. It's time to act. And the Senate said, we need to look at it more. We need to study it more. So there, again, a big debate. The Senate won that, and they essentially formed the Public School Finance Commission to study the system in the interim in between the 86th session, which was in, the 85th session, which was in 2017, and the 86th session, which was in 2019. So the commission was going to consist of 13 members. There were 6 legislators, 3 senators, and 3 House members. 6 members of the public and 1 member from the State Board of Education. And the chair at that time, before I was chair, Donna Bohorich, appointed me to serve as the representative for the State Board of Education on that commission. So it was a really interesting process. Like I said, normally we are in Austin 5 times a year. I look back at my records. I was in Austin 25 times in 2018 when I served on that commission. So it started in January, ended in December. Tons of meetings and public testimonies and subcommittees. I served on a expenditures one of, we had outcomes, what we expected of the Student School Finance Commission. I was on the expenditures, how we're going to spend that money, and then at revenue. So a lot of different work there. And honestly, in the beginning of the session, there were a couple, especially House members, who said this is just a waste of time. We're not going to come to an agreement. Everything's a foregone decision on what they're going to do. And I was hoping that if we got all the right things together, we might, quote unquote, win the commission on like a 7-6 vote. But all that would have done is shown the legislature that there's still disagreement.
Right.
But the end of the story is that we passed 35 recommendations on a unanimous vote, 13-0. And what that led to is HB 3, which was the largest infusion of new money into public education in history of any state, almost $12 billion. Some of that went to tax compression for school tax rates, and the rest, $6.5 billion, went into different programs for the state. And it was anywhere from things like compensatory ed, which is how we fund schools based on children of poverty. So we know that that children of poverty are harder to educate than others. There's more challenges that go with them. But if you have a classroom of 20 kids and you have 1 child of poverty, we funded that district the same as if that child the same as if there was a classroom full. And we know that it's much more difficult to have 20 kids out of 20 that are living in poverty than 1 out of 20. So we did a pretty unique thing and made that a sliding scale. The greater percentage of kids in poverty got more money. The title of our report was focusing funding on students who need it the most. We funded dyslexia for the first time. We always expected our schools to serve our dyslexic students, but we never funded them. We looked at our English language learners and said, well, there's bilingual and different ways to teach that, but dual language was what the studies show it has a lasting effect. So we put more money in dual language. There was, I'm trying to think, there were so many things that went through there. Early childhood reading. We know that between grades K through 3, children are learning to read, but after that, they're reading to learn. And if they don't get that K through 3, if they're not by 3rd grade, if they haven't learned to read, we've probably lost that child. So a lot of focus on K through 3. And then with the end game in mind of what we call CCMR, College and Career Military Readiness. I think maybe 10 or 15 years ago, the state said, we need to get every kid to college. And we realized that's not the case. Not every kid needs to go to college. But we made a mistake in doing that. And so we focused on every kid either needs to go to some sort of college, some sort of secondary, or have a career, or be in the military. There's not many things other things productive than those 3. So we focused on that. So that was a really interesting process to go through.
Yeah, I just think, House Bill 3 is just, it's phenomenal. We talked with Trent a week ago about that and just how proud he was to be part of all of that. And to know that you were a part of that and what led to House Bill 3, that's a great accomplishment.
It was really a historic bill. And the other point I'd bring up on that is I really have a lot of respect for the legislators that I served with. On my subcommittee I mentioned, it was Dan Huberty, who was the chair of public ed. It was Larry Taylor, the chair of education in the Senate. It was Senator West. It was Scott Brister, who was chair of the whole School Finance Commission. And it was me. I was kind of, in my mind, the low man on the totem pole. But there was an example that I'll bring up about transportation and how we did our school bus funding. And what all of those other 4 wanted to do, they said, let's make this simple. Let's just give every student in the state of Texas, let's say $200, and just let districts figure out how to transport them based on that. Well, there's a difference when in a rural area versus in a suburb. Absolutely. And if you're in Katy or you're in Cy-Fair or Frisco, that bus is going to leave a bus barn on a nice paved road. It's going to drive a mile or two, have a bus full of kids, and drop them off at a nice local elementary school there on a paved road. And when that bus leaves the Lufkin School barn, they're maybe on a paved road, and then they're going to get to a gravel road, and then to a dirt road, and then a muddy potholed road to go get one kid. And then they're going to go another distance and go do that. It's not equal on what we have to go through. So I was able to make sure that we funded transportation on a mileage basis. And it's the story I tell just to give all the legislators involved, all the people involved, that everybody's voice was heard. But there were only 2 of the 13, myself and Ken King, Representative Ken King from Canadian out in the Panhandle, were the only rural representatives on that whole 13. So that was one thing I was kind of proud of, is to make sure that the rural voice was heard there.
That's great.
So,
You kind of touched on it there for a second with being a rural representative. So this is very much a representative role. So you represent the geography very much around where the demographic of this podcast listens to. And for people that are listening, you talked about the review boards and the panels. How can they be involved in this? Yeah. So involved in the education and involved in what's going into their children's education.
Yeah. So I talked about the 2 main things we do is set the curriculum standards in the textbooks. And I touched a little bit on how you can be on a review panel for the instruction material, but we also do work groups for the curriculum standards. So when we have a new subject, mainly it's educators who volunteer for this, but they want lay people also. They want business people to serve on these. When we're doing science right now, there's actually a group from an energy sector. They're not educators, but they're involved in the energy sector, and so we've invited them to be part of this. So even business people, parents, community members can contact me, can go to our state board website, and every time we do a subject, there's a chance to serve on some of those panels to provide some input to us.
Excellent. So that'll pull from your 31 county area.
Well, it's anyone across the state can sign up, but if you decided to sign up for it, the way it works is actually it comes to me, and I can veto it. I can say no, I don't like Blake.
Probably a smart decision.
But I like Tara, so I'm going to pick Tara. Or it could be backwards on that. But no, so it comes through the local representative, and then we pick a panel from there. That's how it goes through.
Excellent.
So education in time of COVID.
Yeah.
It's a new world we live in.
It is, yeah. I can relate. My son graduated college in May, so he was going through it not from a K through 12 perspective, but came home from spring break thinking he was going to spend a week at home and go back and have the last couple weeks and months of his college career, and never got to go back. Yeah, and our kids here had the same thing, and that's hard on them. I feel horrible for the high school seniors who never had that same experience of getting to finish with it. We all remember the last couple months of our senior year. May not have learned anything.
I was gonna say,
may not learn anything in a textbook. Yeah, but that was a pretty special time that they missed out on. But unfortunately, that's what happened. But we thought it was just all right. We got to get through a couple weeks here in a month, and come August, it'll all be okay. And obviously, it's not. So the agencies looked through a couple things. They've done home learning 1.0, which is how we got through the spring. Home learning 2.0 is what we can do through the summer to make sure that we kind of keep the momentum of what they learned previous going. And now we're in home learning 3.0. Is this might be a little longer term process than we thought, but it's different for every district out there. I think the agency's done the best they can in the fact that they've given parents the most options available. If you want your kid back in school, they can go back in school. If you want them to stay at home, we're going to figure out a way to do it back at home. But it's just not only over my district is it varied, but across the country. New York their cases were down, so they were fully opening. Chicago and LA were partial. Houston was delayed. Some of the big cities were that. I've just anecdotally throughout my district, anywhere from I'd say 50 to 70% of students were wanting to go back, but some pretty wide variations. So we know, and someone may tell you different, but I just don't believe that distance education is ideal by any means. A quality teacher in a classroom you can't replace that. Yeah. We're doing the best we can with distance learning, but there's challenges to go through that. So
I know that Annalee definitely needs to go to school, because I was not cut to be a teacher, and God bless them for those that are.
I'll tie a statement into that with what I talked about, the School Finance Commission and the new funding that went to schools. Because we always heard the comment, "To much is given, much is expected." But I think with what we've seen that schools have done in this time and how much they do, how much they take care of our children, we've got to look at it a sense of whom much is expected much also needs to be given.
That's right.
Yeah. No, absolutely. It's been eye-opening, especially for us. We tried that route where we did the distance learning for the first few weeks just to kind of see how things were going to go. And it was eye-opening for us. I mean, to realize we've got a first grader, and even at that level, it's I think it's changed a lot of people's opinions on, like what you said, how much should be given to what these organizations do. So your term expires at the end of this year.
Yeah.
What's kind of next after that?
So I'm finishing my first 4-year term. I do have an election in November. I have a Democrat opponent that I'm running against. So, hopefully if that all turns out well, I would normally say another 4 years, but actually we're coming into a redistricting session. So the state board is normally, like I said, a 4-year term, but when they redistrict, if they change one little corner of your district, you have to run again.
Okay.
So realistically, they have to reapportion things. And so I'm running right now, which is 2020, and if I win, would probably have just a 2-year term. Then they'll redistrict and would have to run again in 2022. Yeah. So.
Excellent. So your son, Jake, who I know as well, is kind of following in the footsteps. And how do you feel about that?
Yeah, Jake works for Senator Nichols. He graduated A&M 2 years ago, and about a week later got a job, and he loves it. It's great.
He's doing a great job there.
Yeah.
I'm just happy he's involved in the side of politics where you get paid,
right?
As a parent. So he works with Senator Nichols. He's living up in the Jacksonville, Tyler area, and wherever Senator Nichols goes throughout the day, he goes with them. Yeah. And when they go visit constituents, they're on a superintendent's tour right now. They hit every county in I have 31 counties. They have 18. So as they go through, they meet with all the superintendents. And then when session starts, they move him to Austin, and he works in their capital office during session, and then back to Jacksonville, Tyler area.
He's got the right personality for it.
He's great with that. Yeah. He's got his mom's personality.
That's awesome.
So,
well, we just appreciate all that you're doing for the future of our kids, and for making sure that they're set and teed up to be able to succeed in life, and to be able to go off to college, and to be great citizens, and to be able to give back to the communities that they love. So we appreciate that.
Well, I'm really humbled and honored to serve, not just I serve 31 counties, but this is home, and it's always first in my heart is Angelina County.
Well, thank you for being here.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time. And thank you so much for listening to the podcast. And if you're listening to this podcast on whatever venue or podcatcher you're listening on, please go and rate and review the podcast and subscribe, so that every Monday you'll get a notification letting you know who we're interviewing and what local business or community leader we're kind of tapping into their minds for that week. And also, if you want to catch the video version of this podcast, it is available on the Chamber YouTube as well as the Chamber Facebook page. So thank you so much for listening, and have a great week.